So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I don't need to tell you that the current state we find ourselves in has challenged all of us in ways we could never have predicted. Everyone has stories of how they've been impacted by the pandemic, and everyone has ways in which their lives have been forever changed. But in addition to how it's affected us as individuals and how it's impacted us globally, it's also had an effect on the natural world and our ability to conserve it, which is what we're here to discuss today. We've got about an hour for our speakers with time for question and answer at the end. Please note there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to enter questions as they come to you, and we'll start to answer them at the end. I'm delighted to say we have around 40 Conservation Circle members, trust supporters and friends joining us today. Please do be patient with the web format. This is a new world of total technological dependency. We're all doing our best to make sure it runs smoothly, so we'll keep our fingers crossed that it does. Before we get started, just to introduce, we'll be hearing from Professor Bill Adams, who's joining us from Downing College here in Cambridge, followed by Rebecca Drury, our wildlife trade expert here at FFI, and then James Pilkington, one of our conservation enterprise specialists. But before our speakers get going, it's my pleasure to hand you over to our chair, Andrew Sykes, for a few introductory words. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Matt, and a very warm welcome to everybody. I can see old friends and new looking through the list of participants. It's great to have you with us today, and thank you for making the time. Apologies if it was a struggle logging on. I certainly had a problem with the link, but I think we're getting most people on now. As Matt says, and I don't really need to tell all of you, this has been an absolutely extraordinary and very challenging time. It's been challenging for everyone as individuals, and it's been challenging for businesses and charities and all kinds of organizations. It's been very challenging, not only here in the UK, where all of our colleagues have been working remotely, as all of us have, and getting used to Zoom and every other format known to technologists. But it's different all over the world. In some countries, there's been very little acknowledgement of COVID-19 or a belated one. In others, a very aggressive and in some cases very successful acknowledgement. But it's had, as you'll hear from some of our speakers today, very different impacts on how we work and how our partners work around the world. And it's had a massive impact on some partners in particular. Clearly, tourism has stopped. And for some partners who we work with, who depend on tourism income to support the conservation work that they do, that's created a real crisis. In other parts of the world, rangers who would be out in the field, helping to protect the species and the landscapes that we're trying to conserve, are locked down and can't get out into the wild. And we've seen an upsurge in poaching and illegal wildlife trade. We're all adapting to this. We're all adapting new methods of working, and we're looking at how we can respond. One thing FFI has done, as I'm sure you will have read, is to raise a crisis fund with a very generous donation from Arcadia initially, and we're talking to other potential funders to increase the scale and scope of that fund. And we've started already providing some emergency funding to a number of our partners in critical areas to help them with those big funding gaps that they've got to get out and carry on the vital work that they're doing and keep the show on the road. FFI too has got to think about what the future looks like. I don't think any of us can say really that we know what the world is going to be like in 3 months' time or 6 months' time, perhaps even 12 months' time or longer. This isn't going to be a V-shaped return to normality as we once saw it back in February, back in January. So we've been looking at scenarios, we've been doing scenario planning and working out how we should adapt financially, operationally, how people will work differently in future. But those scenarios keep changing, and we keep thinking and talking to our partners, to other organizations, to people we work with, to work out what the new world might look like and how we should adapt to it. I think one thing you can say about FFI is that it is undoubtedly adaptable. And I'm hugely proud of everything that the team has been doing to respond to this extraordinary world that we're in. And the hallmarks of FFI in terms of innovation and flexibility and adaptability are coming to the fore. You're going to hear lots more, so I'm going to hand over to our other speakers, starting with Bill Adams, who's the Moran Professor of Conservation and Development at the University of Cambridge. He knows FFI well. He's been an FFI trustee and a great friend of FFI. Bill, delighted to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks for inviting me to come along. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the key impacts of COVID-19 on conservation. And I guess the first thing to say is that they're still unfolding. This is not, although in Britain and in some other countries, we think we're over the peak of the pandemic. Many countries are still on the rising curve, particularly this week about Latin America, still some question marks about Africa. So it's early to be editorializing, and that impact's going to unroll. The second thing to say is that the impacts that are hitting conservation are partly the impacts of our response to it. It's not the direct impact, it's the secondary impacts through the changes in the economy and the shutdowns that have taken place. And the third thing, general thing to say is I think those impacts are differentiated. They're not uniform. There's the impacts on the economy, the world economy, the economy of different countries, but there are also impacts on different people within countries. And it's clear that the impacts are being felt globally most severely by the poor, by the people who are most marginal economically, and those who work in the informal sector. So it hurts in different places in different ways, and that's important to remember. What's it doing to conservation? Well, as Andrew mentioned, it's causing a loss of income for conservation organizations and their in-country partners. It's causing a loss of competence, a loss of capacity on the ground as staff are furloughed or even stood down. And many organizations are worrying about their future. Many organizations are less well managed, less well found than FFI. Secondly, it's bringing a loss of income to local communities and the tourism businesses in particular that employ them. People are becoming destitute. People who do not have bank accounts to fall back on, they do not have networks to fall back on, are becoming destitute. And that's a real challenge and a real difficulty. Thirdly, related to that, people are talking about a loss of support for conservation. Both potentially from households in wealthy countries who suddenly find themselves in economically difficult or different circumstances. They're not necessarily going to be so ready to reach into their pockets to support international conservation. And indeed, we may find backlashes against certain kinds of species. Fauna and Flora International earlier guys had a campaign in the UK called Bats Need Friends. It had bumper stickers on cars, I remember, from the 1980s, I think. And bats do need friends at this time because we're just people talking about diseases from wildlife doesn't necessarily make an easy transition for us to get a message of conservation over. And fourthly, there's a loss of biodiversity. People who are hungry and desperate are encroaching on protected areas, or increasing harvesting rates of wild species. And we may well see governments promoting a dash for growth. We may see degazettement or rolling back of environmental regulations from all kinds of governments, not necessarily just poor developing country governments, but also wealthy countries in the global north. And so for conservation, it is a really challenging time. It's also a time with lots of opportunities. Firstly, there's a lot written in the press about how people are valuing nature anew. People are appreciating, in Britain, for example, people talk about the way in which the spring has influenced people. We need to be very careful about that, because the people who are valuing nature anew are often the well-off. And globally, not everybody sort of buys the view of nature we see on TV programs. Nonetheless, there is an awareness, I suppose, of a life which is more more in balance with nature. And that's an opportunity for conservation to say that is what we're interested in. We're interested in a world where nature counts for people. Secondly, there may be an opportunity to shift the way in which the countries and communities where we work think about nature. There are opportunities to persuade people that nature matters, that ecosystems provide services, provide resources which are really important. But also, I think, a challenge to us to talk about the kinds of values that nature gives us, gives humans, in ways that make sense to people. It may be we have to think hard about our message about, obscure rare species, which are wonderful, but maybe not when your family's hungry. So maybe we have to think about our message to people, what kinds of nature we like. And therefore that, in a sense, opens us opportunity to be better listeners in international conservation, not better talkers, not better preachers of a gospel of the protection of rare species, but better listeners to say, okay, if that's what you want your nature to provide you, we can support that. It's not actually what we think, but we'll go with you. We'll move with you on that. So it's challenges to what we think conservation is. And lastly, I suppose the disruption caused by all of this opens up a window to thinking about new ways of organizing economy and society. The way we were running things prior to COVID was destroying biodiversity in almost every country in the world, including the UK. So getting back to that, re-establishing that economy isn't, from a conservation perspective, a very terrific idea. So we need something different. We may think that we're enthusiastic about a shift to a greener way of operating. And that's great, but it has a challenge for us too. It's not particularly green to build a conservation economy on the back of global tourism. Flying around the world is not possible at present with present technologies within the kind of carbon limits we need to halt climate change. So there are real challenges there. How far is conservation going to join a wider environmentalist call for a new kind of global economy? So the pandemic suggests to people, you see it in the press all the time, maybe we should live differently. Maybe we need to live within the envelope of the planet's resources. And it asks us the question, can we do that? Are we brave enough to do that? Do we want to do that? Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Extremely thought-provoking and certainly some challenging questions, I think, for us as conservationists in there as well. We're now going to hear from Rebecca, who's going to discuss how the pandemic is impacting on wildlife trade. Rebecca, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As I'm sure all of you are aware, FFI is working to address illegal wildlife trade across all 4 of our regional programmes. So this includes working with communities and authorities in source areas to both prevent and respond effectively to illegal extraction and illegal trade, to strengthen counter-trafficking measures both nationally and regionally, and also working to influence and support policymakers, consumers and corporations to increase action on illegal extraction, trafficking and demand for illegal products. So I was asked to talk today a little bit about the impacts of COVID on wildlife trade at FFI sites. And as we've heard and as we're all aware, COVID isn't just having severe impacts on human health, but also on people's livelihoods, on their food security and their income. And all of this is having implications for wildlife trade. So in FFI project sites, we're seeing a general trend of increased hunting and fishing for subsistence, resulting directly from this loss of income, from disrupted food supply chains, and an increase generally in the cost of food for the poorest communities. So, for example, we've seen increased hunting of iguanas in Honduras and in sites in the Caribbean for meat. We've also seen increased trapping for wild meat in sites in Myanmar and Vietnam. And this has been directly linked to loss of tourism, high dependence on imported food, particularly in the Caribbean, and a reduction in cross-border trade, all cross-border trade, which is affecting people's incomes. And in some areas, we're also seeing an increase in numbers of people turning to fishing. And we're also seeing increased fishing intensity in inshore areas because there's a lack of access to fuel. And also, as we saw during Ebola outbreaks, we've got increasing numbers of artisanal miners entering Sapo National Park in Liberia, which will all in turn lead to increased subsistence hunting and local trade. But just to highlight that this is a very kind of uncertain and changeable picture, we found that in contrast, when we would expect high hunting levels in Sumatra during Ramadan, we've actually seen low hunting levels, and we think this is due to fewer celebrations being held because everyone was entering lockdown. So in contrast to this increase in subsistence hunting, we've seen a reduction in active transboundary trafficking. This appears to have reduced, at least temporarily, and this is a result of increased border security, disrupted freight and travel, and also importantly, it being less predictable for traffickers to target particular ports or individuals to facilitate entry of illegal goods. Thankfully, despite suggestions that major syndicates have been actively organising poaching parties to take advantage of this time when authorities are diverted and tourists aren't there acting as a deterrent, we're not currently aware of any major poaching events for high value species in any of our sites. We are, however, hearing of stockpiling of high value products, so pangolin scales, ivory, rhino horn, as traffickers are anticipating a revival in the market once restrictions are eased. And so we've not seen any reduction in prices at any of our sites. We're also hearing anecdotal reports, particularly in Vietnam, of increased speculation on rhino horn and ivory. And we know that ivory and rhino horn is considered in China as an investment. So it's perhaps no surprise that we'll see increasing speculation on extinction in any subsequent recession. So I would say, although clearly the picture is highly changeable, it's really uncertain and it's still unfolding in many of our sites, we are potentially looking at an increase in pressure from subsistence, hunting, local trade to replace lost income and food security, alongside a resumption of transnational trafficking once the restrictions are eased, and as the trafficking networks, who are very well resourced, adapt to the new situation. So it's really essential that the FFI and our partners can maintain our activities and can keep responding swiftly to the changes that we're seeing. And that brings me on to what FFI is doing. So I'm pleased to say that in many areas our patrols are back up and running, so in Cambodia and Vietnam, for example. And we're also working with our partners to minimise disruption as much as we can. So for example, in Chualazi in Mozambique, our ranger teams are in isolation together at different outposts. We have protocols in place to minimise risk of transmission should arrests be made. And the FFI Crisis Fund is also supporting our ranger patrols. We're monitoring poaching activity, we're monitoring changes in price, we're looking for displacement of demand to other products. So for example, with some species being touted as immunity boosters to prevent impacts of COVID. And we're also making additional efforts over and above to minimise the impacts of human-wildlife conflict, which of course could exacerbate the impacts on communities who are most affected by COVID already. And then at a global level, I would say that COVID has brought wildlife trade under scrutiny and condemnation more than at any time I can recall. And this provides a window of time to enable change whilst this issue is in the spotlight. And while it's having a direct and tangible impact on so many people. So this includes pushing for greater investment in tackling illegal, unregulated and under-regulated wildlife trade, building on public condemnation for consumption and demand of illegal products, and shifting all of us towards more sustainable use of natural resources and food production systems. And FFI is working alongside many other organisations, particularly with the UK government, to push for ambitious change while we have this window of time, but also working to ensure that these responses are evidence-based, they're targeted, and also they're far-sighted, so they don't deepen poverty, they don't deepen inequality, or they don't remove local incentives to conserve biodiversity, which could have longer detrimental impacts for conservation as a whole. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Rebecca. It's clear that we're looking at a whole complex range of impacts right now in terms of wildlife trade, but it's great to hear that your team is very much focused on the range of things we can be doing to try and tackle that and stay one step ahead of the game. Next, we're going to move over to James Pilkington, who's going to be discussing the impact of the pandemic on tourism and other forms of conservation-related enterprise. James, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. It's estimated that around $300 to $400 billion annually is required to protect our planet's species and ecosystems, but the current funding for conservation is around $52 billion a year. That's only 13% of what's required. And it's clearly that this massive gap is not going to be funded through philanthropy and government spending alone. The only way we're going to fill that gap is through private sector investment. And in order to attract that private sector investment, we need to create business models that provide the resources for conservation organizations to carry out their work, that create incentives for communities to protect wildlife, and crucially, generate a return for investors. And this, in a nutshell, is the responsibility of the Conservation Finance and Enterprise team at FFI, where I work. It's no small job, and it's one that COVID-19 has had a major impact on. And I'm just going to run through a few of those impacts and how we're responding to those. So the various speakers have touched on tourism already, but I think it's important to reiterate that tourism is the kind of go-to industry for conservation organizations looking to develop commercial income streams. And we're all aware of the impact of the pandemic on the global travel market, with the UN World Travel Organization predicting there'll be a 60 to 80% decrease in international arrivals in 2020, and that things aren't going to get back to previous levels until up to 2023. Now, we don't yet have data about how COVID is impacting the income of conservation organizations in the field, but we do have anecdotal evidence from our partners. And what's unfortunate is that the pandemic has hit the hardest those organizations that have been most successful in achieving financial sustainability through income diversification. The guerrilla tourism in Uganda and Rwanda has ceased completely due to the risk of disease transmission, and staff have been laid off. Olpejeta Conservancy in Kenya, one of FFI's most long-standing and highest profile partners, they're reporting daily tourism income in the hundreds of dollars as opposed to the thousands. Staff there have taken a 30% pay cut, and there have been large-scale redundancies. Although it isn't talked about as much, there is another market that's likely to be impacted by the travel collapse, and that's the voluntary carbon market. And this is a market that conservation organizations often rely on to fund large-scale forest protection in the tropics. You know, historically, there's been a large oversupply of carbon credits, and prices have been very low, which means it's been hard to get investment in forest protection projects. But before COVID, this was changing. In 2018, the most recent year for which we have data, there was a 53% increase in carbon credit sales. And it looked like that the kind of historical oversupply of credits was ending, and that prices were due to rise, and that many planned forest protection projects were actually going to be financially viable for the first time. However, the growth in the voluntary carbon market has been driven very much by the airline industry. In 2019, EasyJet made a very large purchase to offset all of its international flights, and that one purchase was 8% of the voluntary carbon market. Other companies like British Airways, Air France and Delta made similar commitments, but with the collapse of much of the international airline industry, I think that growth in the voluntary carbon market is now going to be called into question. But by contrast, despite COVID, we've actually seen international corporations making a number of large commitments to going carbon neutral and offsetting their emissions. So, you know, last week, for example, Volkswagen announced that they were partnering with a large forest protection product developer to become carbon neutral. There's no price tag attached to that. But in the same week, Unilever announced a $1 billion fund for investment in carbon reduction projects. And part of that, they're looking to invest in forest conservation. So what I see is that there's going to be less of an emphasis on sort of these independently financed forest protection projects based on voluntary carbon sales, and increased reliance on getting upfront financing from large multinationals, which means that there's going to be more importance placed on some of those relationships. So moving on to the investors. So what has been the reaction from the conservation finance community to COVID-19? Well, the family offices and impact investment funds that we talk to have not indicated that they're putting their investments on hold. However, they are changing what and where they're looking to invest. For a start, their priorities in countries that have done well in controlling COVID and putting virus control measures in place. Places like Rwanda and Vietnam are of interest. Places like Brazil and Tanzania, where the government has rejected the science on COVID, are really off the agenda. And in terms of what industries they're looking to invest in, well, pretty obviously tourism is not high on the priorities, and construction as well, which is dependent on a growing economy, is also not of interest. Agriculture has continued to be of interest, and there is interest in enterprises which offer import substitutions, so people can buy things domestically rather than bringing them in from abroad. So at FFI, how have we adapted our strategy in the face of these changes? Well, firstly and most obviously, we're spending more time on developing enterprises outside of the tourism sector. We're more focused on agriculture, forestry and fisheries projects than ever before. We've been beefing up our forest carbon capacity, and we're developing a new generation of forest protection projects in places like Belize, Romania and Liberia, using return-based finance, targeting these multinationals that have made commitments to offsetting their carbon. Secondly, and I think this is important, we're talking a lot more about diversifying income. So rather than focusing on one enterprise or one business to deliver financial sustainability and achieve their goals, we work with local partners to develop a range of industries which collectively provide a sort of hedge against different external shocks and increase the resilience of these organizations. For example, in Nyassa, Mozambique, we're working on commercial honey plantation. We're working on looking at a RED Plus, a carbon project based upon better fire management, as well as, you know, a kind of high-end wilderness tourism product. And, you know, this comes to my last point, which is that we're not abandoning tourism. You know, at the end of the day, tourism is a great fit for wildlife-rich areas. It works in remote places, it's inexpensive to establish, and it does generate lots of local employment participation. However, post-COVID, tourism is likely to change. People are looking to travel to places where they can isolate with their families and avoid interacting with large numbers of people. So city breaks may be out, but we're better placed to isolate than one of our stunning wilderness areas and supporting one of our partners. Thanks.
James, thank you. Some fascinating ideas there about how we can go forward and solve some of the challenges we're seeing right now. I'd like to thank all of our speakers so far today. It's there's no doubt it's a rather unusual thing, unless you are a video blogger or a seasoned YouTube influencer. Giving a presentation when you can't see your audience is kind of strange. And I have to say, I think all three of our speakers have done a marvelous job with that, and I'm glad to see that the technology has held up. I just want to say a few things about the way that FFI is going forward, the things we're doing, and how we hope to help as this whole thing unfolds. We've heard a lot about how the situation is changing as a result of the pandemic, and it's having real implications for our partners in many places around the world. And as you know, partnerships at the heart of everything we do, rooted in our firm belief that local people and organisations hold the key to conservation long term. And at FFI, we stick with those partners through thick and thin, however difficult it gets. It's a mark of how we do conservation. And that's why last month we launched our Partner Crisis Support Fund, which Andrew referred to earlier. It's a fund that's focusing very much on our existing in-country partners, helping those organisations to weather the current storm and to flourish over the longer term as we adapt to new realities beyond the current pandemic. And thanks to very generous support from the Arcadia Fund and others, we've already secured over $1 million towards that crisis support fund for our partners. And even better, we've already spent it. Rapid response is something that FFI has done well for many, many years, especially in crisis situations. And part of that is making sure the funds reach the ground straight away. Right now, we're helping some of our most hard-pressed partners to tackle some of their immediate challenges across the world. And this includes community associations in Western Uganda that have been managing forest corridors critical for chimpanzees and who have found their livelihoods from agriculture and small-scale trade devastated by COVID restrictions. The return to logging would offer a rapid and guaranteed income, but of course would have really negative environmental impacts. So to head that off, we provided 6 months support to those community associations to support their members to continue forest stewardship and chimpanzee monitoring. On a larger scale, we're providing similar support to community wildlife conservancies across northern Kenya that, as James has been saying, seen tourism evaporate as well as livestock markets closed. We heard a little earlier about Honduras. Our partner there is reliant on paying volunteers to maintain its iguana station and breeding program, volunteers that can no longer visit, of course. And so there, we're providing funds for day-to-day running costs for 3 months to allow that organization to continue what it's doing, protecting and breeding those iguanas, as well as funds to help them engage with communities to tackle that current increase in illegal hunting that's a complete side effect of food insecurity and livelihood losses. On the island of Mayo in Cape Verde, our partners also lost out, and this time twice, both from the downturn in tourism income, but also the loss of government grants as funds are diverted into other pressing emergency needs. And that change in grant funding is something we are witnessing in a lot of places. So through our crisis support fund, we're supporting our partner in Mayo, FMB, to maintain both turtle protection and associated other conservation interventions throughout the remainder of this year. But alongside responding to immediate needs like these, there's an opportunity to think ahead and to help organisations to become more resilient to shocks like the current pandemic and to grasp opportunities for new ways of achieving conservation impact. And so for that reason, we're not stopping when this immediate crisis abates. And our aim is to build our partner support fund for the longer term, so that after helping our partners to survive the current challenges, we can also help them to adapt and to thrive longer term. I'd like now to invite all of our speakers to come on screen and to engage in conversation and to answer some questions from our audience. And I think Laura is going to facilitate this for us. So I'm going to look and see if I've got some questions here. All right, first question. How do we translate COVID into a tipping point, like we've seen with the mobilization in recent weeks in support of the Black Lives Matter campaign? Is this something that could have a real transitional change for the environment, for conservation? Who'd like to take that one? Maybe it's one for Bill, I don't know. Bill?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the difficult thing about it is that lots of different people have different views about what sort of moment this is. Arundhati Roy rather nicely described the COVID pandemic as a portal, saying we have to pass through this portal and we have to decide whether we're going to bring the old world through it or whether we're going to try and make a world that is fairer and more sustainable. And that's, if you like, a rather radical interpretation of the tipping point. A lot of other people are saying, you know, particularly in government, is saying, actually, we just need to get back. We've got to restart the economy, do anything we need to do. So yes, I think, you know, the notion is, I think what it challenges us, and for me, what it challenges to do is to think what more boldly about the kind of world we're trying to create, not just how many species there should be surviving in it and how much habitat, but also what is the kind of world that supports that, and what is the kind of world we want to live in. So yeah, I think it's an interesting and rather big opportunity for conservation to link up to wider debates about things like climate change, about justice. But that's a big ask for even for an organisation like FFI.
Yeah, indeed. Andrew, I wonder if I might turn to you. You've had a long association with FFI. You've seen a lot of changes that have taken place over time. What's your sense of how this could really take things in a different direction?
Thank you, Matt. I think there's a big risk here, and Bill put his finger on it, that while everybody's been in lockdown, there's been a great sort of outpouring of, oh my goodness, the birds are singing, and there are dolphins in Venice, and this is all wonderful, and if only we can live like this, wouldn't that be great? And that's a very Western, northern view. It's a privileged view of the world. And at the same time as all of that sort of nice feeling has been going on in the rich part of the globe, there have been people both in the rich part of the globe and in all the poorer countries around the world who are really struggling. And we've been hearing about that this morning. And I think there's a massive imperative to get the world economy going again. And we saw after the financial crisis in 08-09 that a lot of the enthusiasm and the hope for example, carbon and maybe carbon taxes really receded into the background. So I think FFI is not a great big organization that can spend millions of dollars on lobbying politicians, and nor should it. I think what has always been great about FFI is what it does at a practical level, a very practical level. And it has to recognize, we all have to recognize that the way to move forward is to join the dots. That you need, and it's what FFI has always done. And by joining the dots, I mean recognizing that the way to get conservation success is through improving human livelihoods and connecting those things together. We have a huge shock to the system, and James talked about it on the tourism side. Rebecca talked about it in terms of how people are struggling, and so inevitably they're going out looking for protein differently in different places. But we're going to have to think creatively about how all of that works at the same time as the political imperative is, for God's sake, let's get the economy going, and all this conservation stuff's all very well, but it's a nice to have. And remind everyone that actually a healthy world is one that's a better world, and that there is environmental capital that is essential. And it's not just about carbon, it's also about watersheds. And I think it's also that if you don't want to have another shock to the system, then do something about the wet markets in China. And maybe that's a segue to another question that's in there in the Q&A.
Indeed. Thank you, Andrew. You're one step ahead of me. A lot of useful thought there in terms of how we might need to think about our narrative as well. So yes, Rebecca, what changes are China introducing to wildlife trade, and what impact might that have?
Sorry, so could you repeat the question?
Sorry, yes. Turning to China, do you have a sense of the changes that China might be introducing in terms of wildlife trade and what impact that might be having?
Yeah, okay, so China are currently in the process of revising their wildlife protection law. So in February, they announced some decisions, and they announced they were going to ban commercial trade in terrestrial species for consumption as food. So that's a really positive step, but it does mean that it currently excludes breeding and trade in wildlife products for pets, for ornamental use, and for traditional medicine, which means, for example, pangolin scales would still be legal, well, not legal, but could still continue, and captively bred tiger products, for example. And also, because it's focused on terrestrial, it would exclude things like salamanders, turtles, and frogs. And there's also some question marks about exclusions for species classed as livestock, which could enable some laundering. Mm-hmm. So I think lots of positive steps. It's heartening to see there's condemnation amongst the public in China for consumption of illegal products, which is just something a minority of Chinese populace engage in. So I think we would like to see the changes to the policy extended to products used as pets, ornaments, and traditional medicines, and we're pushing for that along with others. So there's an opportunity, I think, to really enshrine these changes in legislation, but we've yet to see how far the revisions will be taken.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, one of our audience participants is noting there are reports of substantial local declines in ivory prices in Congo, in Lagos, in Uganda, and on the Vietnam-China border. It's elephant ivory we're talking about. Though there might be slight increases reported elsewhere. Is that something you're detecting? And what do you think is behind that?
Yeah, so it seems to be really highly variable, the picture, and I think it depends on where you are in the trade chain as well. So, for example, we might record prices for pangolin scales at source in Sumatra, and then another organisation might record the price and the demand level at a different point in the trade chain, and that's always going to be variable. So that might be the cause for that variation. I think it will depend largely on, I think the sense we're getting is that consumer demand is reduced, while, for example, Chinese tourists aren't traveling to Cambodia, for example, where there's a kind of thriving ivory market. So that if you're selling ivory, you're a vendor, you might be seeing reduced prices. But if you're a trafficker and you've got the cash flow, you might be stockpiling because you're anticipating speculation on extinction and a resumption of trade once restrictions are eased. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, it might not all be good news indeed. James, can I turn to you? Another question we have here. It appears that we're seeing a significant increase in impact funds and multinational organisations starting funds to invest in environmental projects. This will only increase as we move through COVID and into the future. The question is FFI advising any of these funds or organisations in order that they may create real and needed impact?
It's quite a timely question. Actually, we just recently signed a memorandum of understanding with a new startup investing in renewable energy projects in Africa that wants to use the income to provide a return for conservation in the countries in which they invest. So that is definitely happening. I think, for me, the biggest challenge is when you look at the global impact investing pie, only about 1% is invested in conservation, whereas more than 25% is invested in health, for example. So for me, it's less talking about the intrinsic value of nature, but more about the way in which investing in nature delivers human development outcomes. And I think, the sort of pandemic issue and this issue about kind of zoonotic diseases lends itself to saying, look, investing in nature is a health issue. And for impact investment funds that want to invest in achieving health incomes, and actually conservation can help them. Similarly with employment, in a lot of the places we work, people's natural assets are really their greatest opportunity to create sustainable livelihoods and employment. And so we need to talk about investing in nature in order to create employment outcomes, human development outcomes, and health outcomes, rather than just relying on saying, it's important to protect these things because of their intrinsic value. Whether that's good or bad is another question.
No, indeed, you're absolutely right. And I think we'd all agree we're expecting to see significant investment in economic stimulus and recovery once this thing works its way through, and how we build the environmental narrative, how we build nature-based reconstruction into this is going to be critical. We've talked a little bit about the FFI crisis funds during this afternoon's set of presentations. We talked about the work we're doing there to help partners through and to help them rebuild. There's an increasingly loud conversation happening amongst conservation organisations, community development organisations, and the tourism industry, particularly focused around Africa, on how collectively we can bring our voices together to take to those multilateral and bilateral entities that will be investing in that kind of stimulus to try and ensure that these messages are at the heart of what is spent. James, if I can stick with you for a moment, and also sticking with tourism, do you see whether there are any ways that we can influence consumers' behaviour in relation to tourism in a way that will positively impact the conservation agenda?
Well, I think, COVID's been termed the great accelerator. And in terms of tourism, I do expect to see an acceleration in some of the pre-existing trends. So, around people wanting a deeper experience, wanting two-way learning, wanting to spend more time in places, and have a more meaningful interaction than a quick drive around the reserve and taking a few pictures. You know, we're seeing from a lot of our like kind of travel agencies we work with, you know, they're asking for more nature-based holidays closer to home. So we've been able to promote some of our projects in places like Turkey and Romania and even the UK as destinations. So there's really good, you know, potential outcomes in that. And then finally, I think it's about national tourism. And, you know, Old Peggotter's been very successful in attracting national tourists into what is generally seen as like a bit of a white person's game, which is, you know, safari tourism, and thinking about how we can create this sort of experiences for people with nature that are going to be attractive to a domestic audience is going to be increasingly important going forward.
No, indeed, those domestic opportunities, I'm sure, have knock-on effects as well in terms of raising the value of nature through the experience people have, and as you say, not simply being an international sort of wealthy pursuit. Bill, I'd like to bring you in on this one. You made reference earlier to perhaps, you know, maybe not an unhealthy alliance, but certainly a potentially fragile alliance between tourism and a reliance on international tourism as one key funding mechanism, particularly for national parks in areas where you've got that large megafauna to use as a product. But also, of course, a lot of communities in the places that we are focusing on rely quite heavily on the kind of income. A lot of governments rely on that forex, that tax revenue. How do you see a way around this?
Thank you, Matt. That's a tricky question. Look, we 1930s, what was then what FFI was then, which was a much smaller organization, sent someone out to East Africa to find national parks. He went out there and visited the then colonial territories and looked for places national parks. And one of his big arguments was that he would pick places that were not needed for other things. They were not suitable for intensive agriculture. They did not contain mineral resources. And he would use them, could be used as the basis for the economic development of African territories. And that idea we still have it. That notion is that wildlife is a resource and you can build this industry onto it. And of course, with the rise of air travel in the 1960s and 1970s, it started to be something which didn't require a 6-month safari by some amazingly wealthy person, but could be done quite quickly in a week or 2 weeks. And I think the problem with it is the fact that at the moment we don't have a technological means of shifting people across the earth in aeroplanes, which operates within the kind of carbon envelope that we're told is needed to stop runaway climate change. So, you know, I think the notion, the work that's been done at Old Peggotter, which is trying to develop a domestic tourism industry as countries like Kenya, you know, escape from poverty, as people escape from poverty, as the whole economy builds up. They are trying to build an economy which unlike the one we built in the 19th century, and it is relatively carbon neutral. And it seems to me that's the future. So we have somehow to steer out of this 100-year bubble that we've been in, thinking that the way to do conservation is to get, you know, rich, mostly white people onto aeroplanes to have a quick holiday and then come back again. And you turn that over as quickly as you can. And it just doesn't seem to me that that's a sustainable model in the long term. It is the only thing that keeps communities going right now. That's true, partly because we've built it. So my challenge is, how do you build something else? How do you offer sustainable livelihoods to people which are not dependent on that carbon guzzling structure of industry? And then how do you persuade those of us who would dream of doing that as a holiday, would love to be, you know, on the beach, which is pictured behind you with the turtle at dusk? How do you tell us, actually, you can't do that anymore? The good thing about that is we turn around and saying, right, well, in that case, the environment where I live has got to get a whole lot better. We don't have turtles, but, you know, why haven't we got more butterflies, more swifts and more skylarks? So we might turn into rather active conservationists at home if we could no longer say, yeah, the place I live is in the dump, but boy, I've got this amazing holiday in this rainforest lodge coming up. That's going to be lovely. It'll make do with the fact that the country I live in doesn't have enough biodiversity. So that's unhelpful and dreamy and radical, but I do think I do think there's a problem in there we need to address. Thanks.
Thank you. That's extraordinary. Andrew, we have a question directed specifically at you. In relation to some of the challenges you've talked about, what do you think makes FFI so resilient to those challenges?
I think that's a great question. And I think Bill's challenge just now to, the model that we've got currently on tourism is an excellent one. And what that highlights is that you think you've cracked it, and so it's okay, we've nailed it. We're going to have carbon, and we're going to have tourism, and the world is going to be looked after. Hooray, job done. Just keep building the projects, build the lodges, sorted. It's not like that, is it? And the reason it's not like that is that the world keeps changing, the challenges keep changing. The reason I think FFI is resilient is that it is full of really creative people. It has a culture that is one of not saying, okay, well, we're from Cambridge and we're going to come and tell you how to do it. It is, what's the problem? How do we need to work together to fix it? What are the people on the ground thinking? And to Bill's point, conservation really works when it's the people on the ground who actually own it. And the fact that FFI works with and through local partners and is invited to come and help those local partners grow and create the right infrastructure that is going to help in the long term. So not coming and imposing, not being dogmatic, constantly challenging what you're doing, and having really great people who are capable of doing that, which is easier said than done. So I think that's what makes FFI resilient in what's an extraordinarily challenging time. I think more prosaically, perhaps, from a financial point of view, FFI is fortunate that its funding model is one where it's engaged with multiple funding sources, from governments to corporations to investment funds to individuals. And that's constantly adapting, and it needs to continue to improve. There are charities I'm involved with in some other ways who are crucially dependent on particular sources of income. It might be government funders or events or whatever. So, and if you are very dependent on one area, you can very rapidly fall over. So there are the people, but there's also the money, which is, as we know, what makes the world go round. And the way that our funding model works is very important. But above all, it's about people, it's about the culture of the organization and the sort of people I have the pleasure in spending time with and in sessions like this. So a long-winded answer, but one I feel very strongly about.
I fully agree. Thank you, Andrew. We've got questions coming in thick and fast now, but we're also running out of time. I'm just going to pick a couple of quick ones, and then I think it's possible that we'll be able to keep the regular beyond this session. I'm sure that's something we can do. Question that came in from me: how long do I think, or we think, we'll need the crisis fund for? Well, the idea with our crisis fund is very much that it evolves into a resilience fund longer term. So I think whilst we all hope that the crisis in terms of immediate emergency support is something we won't need to see for too long, and hopefully over the next few months and beyond, but that we I think it's something that's at the heart of our strategy going forward, and we will keep it there. And then very quickly, a question which I'm going to ask each of the speakers today, and you, Andrew, to give a very brief answer to. Given the extent of the issues being faced, what makes you hopeful that COVID-19 will be? I guess, are you hopeful? Are you optimistic that actually out of this crisis we can find something really lasting? Let's start with Bill, then Rebecca, then James and Andrew.
Yeah, I think good things can be made to come out of it, but I do think we need to be very, what's the word? Oh, perhaps alert is the word. I've heard that around somewhere. We have to watch quite carefully, because I think there can be quite destructive things coming out of it for conservation. So I think we do need to look for the good things and push for them, and then I think we'll get some positive changes. Above all, I think there's the chance of engaging people in a discussion beyond what is every day. And there's that opportunity, I think, in a lot of countries. A lot of people have been shaken by this. We all have, of course. And there's a chance to think, okay, so what are we doing? Why are we doing it like that? And that has to be a good thing.
Excellent, thank you. Rebecca.
Yeah, I'm optimistic that we can make some positive changes around illegal wildlife trades, given the unprecedented focus for it to everyone's attention. I think the key thing for me is just to make sure that this is nuanced, and also that wildlife trade isn't treated as a sticky plaster, when actually we need to look hard at wider issues such as food production and habitat loss.
Fantastic, thank you, Rebecca. James, what do you think?
I talked about that 80% funding gap and the importance of the private sector. Well, actually, the challenge is not a lack of investors, and the challenge is not a lack of potential projects that could be invested in. The challenge is the conservation industry itself making radical changes in how it seeks to address the problems that it sees on the ground. So I think, we're asking the world to change, to put more priority on nature, but actually we need to think about how do we ourselves change in an industry in terms of how do we achieve our objectives to respond to that changing world.
I think you're absolutely right, James. And lastly, Andrew.
Yes, I think James referred to COVID as the great accelerator. I think there are some big trends currently which predate COVID. So if you think about Greta Thunberg and then more recently Black Lives Matter, I think there's a huge upswelling of opinion that the models that we've got, the economic models that we've got, don't work, and that there's a big problem and we need some big change. And I think if conservation organizations can be intelligent about how we can join conservation in that whole conversation about our socioeconomic model and how it needs to adapt, I'm very optimistic. But like Bill, I think you've got to be a really realistic optimist, and we've got to really work at it. It's no good being the conservationists who say, come on, COVID shows you that you must do stuff differently. You've got to think about how does this work for people? And I do think people want change. I think you're seeing it all over the world in every walk of life. And we've got to fit conservation within that and go with the grain of that. And then against that, I am very, very positive and very optimistic about the potential for change.
And that's a great place to end today. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. And thank you to all of our speakers for what I certainly feel has been a really fascinating and enlightening session. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have so many people continuing to engage with us and work with planet. If you'd like to learn more about our crisis fund, or if you wish to donate to it, then Laura will add the links to these into the chat box. That's and we will certainly follow up with you on that. This is the first of these we're doing. It's certainly not the last. We'll be having a few more dates to send out to you for future webinars.
Thank you all.